There is a kind of silence that is not chosen. It is imposed, stamped onto you like a classified mark on a government file. And the most unbearable part of that silence is not the absence of words. It is what fills the space where those words should have been. Pride, horror, the weight of knowing, the knowledge that millions of people are alive because of what you did, and not a single one of them knows your name. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Really, sit with it. You win the most catastrophic war in human history. You sit at the center of one of the greatest intellectual achievements the world has ever seen. You watch, in real time, as the intelligence you produce saves convoys from being sunk, guides Allied bombers toward their targets, exposes enemy movements before they happen. You see the war turn, you feel the moment. The tide shifts. And then, when it is over, a man in a suit hands you a piece of paper. And that paper tells you that you are never to speak of any of it. Not to your wife, not to your children, not to any colleague you may meet in the street. The secret you carry will go with you to your grave, and the world will move on without ever knowing what you gave it. That was the life of Gordon Welchman. And for 4 decades, that is exactly what happened. My name does not matter here. What matters is the story. And this story is one of the most extraordinary, most overlooked, and most unjustly buried accounts of the Second World War. It is a story about genius, about duty, about the unbearable cost of secrecy, and about what governments are willing to do to the men who serve them most faithfully when those men finally dare to speak. Gordon Welchman was born on June 15, 1906, in Fishponds, Bristol. His father was a Church of England vicar, a man of discipline, of quiet conviction, of service. That upbringing shaped Welchman in ways that would not become fully visible until the war. He was the youngest of 3 children. He was mathematically gifted in the way that certain people are gifted, not just fast at calculation, but genuinely able to see patterns where other people saw only noise. He won a scholarship to Marlborough College, one of England's most respected independent schools, and then went on to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he read mathematics and achieved a double first, the highest academic distinction the university awarded. By the late 1930s, Gordon Welchman was a fellow at Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge. He was teaching algebraic geometry. He had a young wife. He had a son. He had the quiet, measured life of a British academic, and no particular reason to expect that the century would ask anything extraordinary of him. But the century had other plans. In the spring of 1939, with war visibly approaching, the British government's Government Code and Cipher School, the GC&CS, began quietly recruiting. They reached out to mathematicians, linguists, crossword puzzle experts, chess champions, anyone whose mind worked differently. Welchman was contacted, told that he might be called upon for some kind of secret government work if war broke out, and asked to attend an introductory briefing at Broadway Buildings in London. He went. He heard very little of substance, and then he drove back to Cambridge, returned to his lectures, and waited. On September 4, 1939, one day after Britain declared war on Germany, Gordon Welchman packed a bag into his 3-wheeler Morgan motor car, kissed his wife and baby son goodbye, and drove 50 miles north to a red brick, Victorian country estate in the Buckinghamshire countryside called Bletchley Park. He did not know exactly what he was driving toward. He had been told almost nothing. He arrived, found himself assigned to a group doing initial research on Enigma, the German military cipher machine, and was shown to a windowless schoolroom that smelled of old textbooks and damp plaster. With him was one eccentric codebreaker and a pile of unencrypted Enigma practice messages. That is where Gordon Welchman's war began. You need to understand what Enigma was and what breaking it meant to understand what Gordon Welchman did. The Enigma machine was the nervous system of the German military. Every order, every deployment, every supply movement, every tactical communication at every level of the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, and eventually the Kriegsmarine passed through Enigma. The machine looked like a complicated typewriter. When an operator pressed a key, electrical current flowed through a series of rotating wheels rotors and an array of cable connections called a plug board, and a different letter lit up on a display board. The operator wrote down that letter. The next key press changed the rotor positions, so the same letter pressed twice would produce two completely different encrypted outputs. The Germans believed it was mathematically unbreakable. The number of possible configurations ran into the hundreds of quintillions. Every day at midnight, all settings were changed. If you hadn't solved that day's keys before midnight, you started from zero again. The Polish cryptanalysts, men like Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rojek, and Henryk Cygalski, had made brilliant early progress in the 1930s. They had designed an electromechanical device called the Bombe to search for Enigma cities, but when the Germans upgraded the machine in 1938, adding more rotors and more plugboard connections, the Polish approach became insufficient. In July 1939, weeks before the German invasion of Poland, the Polish Cipher Bureau passed everything they had to British and French intelligence. It was one of the most selfless acts of intelligence sharing in history, and it was what Bletchley Park built upon. Alan Turing arrived at Bletchley Park almost simultaneously with what Turing's genius was already the stuff of legend. He had published his foundational paper on computability in 1936, the paper that described what we now call the Turing machine and laid the conceptual ground for modern computing. At Bletchley, Turing focused on Hut 8, breaking the German naval Enigma. He designed an electromechanical machine, the British Bombe, that tested possible Enigma settings against cribs, which were known or guessed plaintext phrases. If a German weather report always began with the same format, if a station always sent its identification header in the same way, those patterns became weapons. The bomb ran through combinations at high speed, looking for logical contradictions. When it found none, it had potentially identified a valid setting. Turing's bomb was a revolutionary machine, but it had a critical weakness. T-plugboard, the switchboard of cables at the front of the Enigma machine that scrambled letters before they even reached the rotors, created a combinatorial problem that slowed the bomb to an almost unworkable pace. There were too many possible plugboard configurations. The bomb was finding valid settings, but it was also generating enormous numbers of false positives, plausible settings that turned out on inspection to be wrong. Every false positive meant wasted time, and time at Bletchley Park was measured in convoys sunk, in men killed and intelligence lost. Then Welchman saw something that nobody else had seen. He was sitting in that windowless schoolroom, working through stacks of intercepted messages, and he began to notice something about the architecture of the Enigma plugboard itself. The plugboard connected letters in pairs. If A was plugged to R, then R was plugged to A. This reciprocal relationship was an inherent design feature of the machine. Welchman realized that this property, this structural symmetry, could be exploited mathematically in a way that dramatically reduced the number of possible configurations the bomb had to check. He designed an additional circuit, a grid of wiring that would later be called the diagonal board, that could be attached to Turing's bomb, and that used the plugboard's own reciprocal logic against it. The diagonal board eliminated approximately 99% of false positives. What had taken days could now be done in hours. What had been operationally marginal became operationally decisive. When Welchman showed the diagonal board concept to Turing, Turing's reaction was immediate and unambiguous. He recognized it as a breakthrough. He told Welchman so directly. Here were two of the most gifted mathematical minds of the 20th century, sitting in wartime England, and one had just handed the other the key to the most important intelligence operation in the history of warfare. Turing is reported to have said that Welchman's contribution was something he himself had entirely missed. That is not a small thing to say. Alan Turing admitting he missed something is the intellectual equivalent of a master surgeon saying a junior colleague found an organ he overlooked. But Welchman did not stop there. He had not just invented a circuit. He had looked at the entire Bletchley Park operation from the outside, from a systems perspective, and concluded that it was going to fail. unless it was redesigned from the ground up. In those early weeks, Bletchley Park was still organized along the lines of a peacetime intelligence office. A handful of brilliant individuals worked in isolation, passing notes between rooms. There was no production line. There was no structured flow of intercepted material from capture to decryption to distribution. There were no formal procedures for managing the thousands of messages that were about to start arriving as the war escalated. Welchman wrote a proposal. He laid out an organizational architecture for how Bletchley Park needed to work, how the interception stations scattered across. Britain needed to feed their traffic to centralized analysis hubs, how the huts needed to be functionally divided by cipher type, how the bombs needed to be managed as a fleet rather than as individual machines, how the flow of intelligence from decrypted message to military commander needed to be streamlined and protected. He proposed the hut system. He argued for massive expansion, more bombs, more staff, more investment, at a time when the establishment still treated code-breaking as a niche academic activity. He was not asking for marginal improvements. He was redesigning the architecture of victory. In October 1941, Welchman joined Turing and two other senior Bletchley figures, Hugh Alexander and Stuart Milner Barry, in writing directly to Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They bypassed the entire military chain of command. They wrote that Bletchley Park was critically under-resourced, that the work they were doing could be decisive for the war, and that bureaucratic inertia was strangling their capacity. Churchill read the letter. His response was delivered within hours. He wrote, "Make sure they have all they want on extreme priority," and then added two words that became legend in the halls of Bletchley Park. Action this day. The resources came. The bombs multiplied. By 1943, Hut 6, the section Welchman had built and led, was breaking more than 20 Enigma keys per day and producing thousands of decrypts every 24 hours. By the end of the war, there were hundreds of bomb machines operating at Bletchley Park and satellite locations. The intelligence they produced, codenamed Ultra, was feeding directly into Allied high command. Eisenhower would later call Ultra the decisive advantage of the war. Others have estimated it shortened the conflict by 2 years. Some have put the number of lives saved in the millions. Gordon Welchman was at the center of all of it, not as a figurehead, not as an administrator, as the man who built the machine that ran the machine. And then the war ended. And then the silence began. In 1945, as the last echoes of gunfire faded across a devastated continent, the men and women of Bletchley Park were called together, told that the work they had done was among the most classified operations in the history of British intelligence, and ordered to say nothing about any aspect of it to anyone, ever. They signed oaths under the Official Secrets Act. They were not allowed to discuss the work among themselves, even in private. They could not write about it, lecture on it, or hint at it in conversation. A woman who had spent years operating a bomb machine could sit next to a man at a dinner party who had decrypted the messages she helped produce, and neither of them could so much as exchange a knowing glance. The wall between them was total. For the British government, this secrecy served a clear strategic purpose. In the post-war years, the Allies sold and distributed captured German Enigma machines to emerging nations across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, presenting them as secure communications devices. Those nations used Enigma to encode their most sensitive diplomatic and military traffic. British and American intelligence read it all. If word got out that Enigma had been broken, the game would be over. The secrecy of Ultra was not nostalgia. It was an ongoing intelligence operation. The silence was still a weapon. Gordon Welchman understood this. He was not a naive man. He had spent years operating at the intersection of mathematics and warfare, and he understood better than almost anyone why the secret had to hold. He moved to the United States in 1948. He worked on Project Whirlwind at MIT, a pioneering project applying computers to air traffic control. He eventually joined the MIT Corporation, a defense research nonprofit, where he worked on secure military communications work that drew directly on the thinking he had done at Bletchley, though he could never say so. He built a life. He raised a family. He went to faculty dinners and corporate retreats and never once let slip what he had actually done during the war. If the conversation turned to the war, and it always did, in those years Welchman listened, said little, and changed the subject. Imagine carrying that. Imagine watching the world rebuild itself around a lie of omission so large that it constituted its own kind of reality. The history books said the Allies won because of industrial might, because of American production, because of Soviet sacrifice on the Eastern Front. All of those things were true. But the books left out the room in Buckinghamshire where a man with a three-wheeler Morgan and a pencil and an idea about plugboard symmetry had helped turn the tide. Every year, Welchman watched the story of the war being told. Without him, every year, the men who had planned the operations and led the battles received their decorations, and their medals and their chapters in the official histories. The men and women of Bletchley Park received nothing but their silence. There is a particular cruelty in that, not just the invisibility, though the invisibility was real and lasting. The cruelty was in the specificity of the knowledge. Welchman did not simply know in a vague way that he had contributed to the Allied cause. He knew, in precise and granular detail, exactly what had been read, exactly when, exactly how the intelligence had been used, and exactly which operations had succeeded or failed as a result. He had watched the war from the inside, in a way that no general, no politician, no historian had. He carried a complete and classified picture of one of the most consequential events in human history, and he had to carry it alone. Decades passed. His first marriage ended. He grew older in America. He watched Sputnik go up, and the moon landings happen, and Vietnam burn, and the Cold War settle into its long, grinding stalemate. And through all of it, the secret held. Then, in 1974, a retired Royal Air Force officer named Frederick Winterbotham published a book called The Ultra Secret. It was the first public account of the Enigma operation. Winterbotham had been the man responsible for distributing ultra-intelligence to Allied commanders in the field, and after consulting with the relevant authorities, he had been cleared to publish a limited account of the program. The book caused a sensation. Historians scrambled to re-evaluate the war. Generals who had kept their own secrets for 30 years suddenly felt free to acknowledge what they had known. The word ultra entered the public vocabulary. For Welchman, the publication of Winterbotham's book was a kind of partial liberation. The broad fact that Enigma had been broken was now public. The oath he had signed still existed, but the largest secret, the secret that the secret had been kept, was out. He began to think about writing his own account, not because he wanted fame. He had spent decades without it, and had learned to live with that absence. He wanted to write because he was, by 1974, one of the last people alive with first-hand technical knowledge of how the operation had actually worked. Winterbotham's book had described the intelligence and its effects, but it had not described the machinery. The actual cryptanalytic methods, the bombe, the diagonal board, the organizational systems that had made Bletchley Park function. That knowledge was dying with the people who held it. It took Welchman 8 years to write the book. 8 years of careful reconstruction, of correspondence with surviving colleagues, of working from his own memory at an age when memory was no longer perfectly reliable. He wrote in longhand. He checked his recollections against what little had been declassified. He tried to be precise, because precision was what the story demanded. The book was called The Hut 6 Story. It was published in and then his troubles began. Within weeks of publication, Welchman was contacted by agents representing American intelligence. They informed him that certain passages in the book described cryptanalytic techniques that were still considered classified. Not because they were directly applicable to modern communications systems, but because they fell within the scope of long-standing secrecy agreements between the American and British governments. Welchman was 75 years old. He had written the book in good faith, having concluded that a methodology developed around an electromechanical cipher machine from the 1930s could not possibly represent a live national security threat in the age of digital computing. He had been wrong, at least in the eyes of the intelligence establishment. His security clearances were revoked. His consulting contract with MITRE, which he had held for 20 years, was terminated. He was told he could not discuss the book, could not give media interviews, could not publicly elaborate on anything he had written. He was, once again, silenced. But this time the silence was not the dignified, understood, consensual silence of a man who knows why the secret must be kept. This time it was punitive. This time it felt like punishment for the act of remembering. Welchman later wrote about that moment with a precision that was more devastating than any expression of anger could have been. He described being called a security risk. He, the man who had built the intelligence system that had done more than almost anything else to secure Allied victory in the war. He wrote about the surreal quality of having his badge taken away 42 years after Hut 6 had its first success. He did not rage. Observed, and in the gap between what he had done and what was being done to him, there was something that had no adequate name. He continued to correspond with colleagues. He continued to think and write. He tried, in the time he had left, to set down as much of the technical record as he could in ways that would survive him. He wrote a final paper, From Polish Bombe to British Bombe, The Birth of Ultra, that traced the full genealogy of the code-breaking effort from the Polish cryptanalysts through to the industrial decryption operation he had helped build. He submitted it for publication. He did not live to see it in print. Gordon Welchman died on October 8, 1985. At the age of 79, the paper was published posthumously in 1986. In 2015, 30 years after his death, the BBC made a documentary about him. They called it Bletchley Park. Code Breakings. Forgotten Genius. The American broadcaster Smithsonian Channel called it The Code Breaker Who Hacked Hitler. The film drew on his personal papers, which his children had preserved in a loft for years, undisturbed, waiting for a world that was ready to hear what they contained. Now, I want you to think about something, because this is where the story stops being about Gordon Welchman specifically and starts being about something larger. It starts being about the architecture of how history is told and who gets to tell it and at what cost. The 20th century produced an enormous number of people who knew things they were not allowed to say, not criminals, not traitors, servants, scientists who built weapons and were bound by classification, intelligence officers who watched events unfold from behind a wall of secrecy, cryptanalysts who solved problems that changed the world and then went back to their offices and said nothing. The official story of the Second World War, the version that appears in the textbooks, the version that was taught to an entire generation, was written without the most important chapter. The chapter about what was read in the signals traffic, the chapter about what the Allies knew and when they knew it, the chapter about the room in Buckinghamshire where the war was being watched in real time. When Winterbottom published in 1974, historians were forced to go back and reconsider 30 years of analysis. Decisions that had seemed mysterious. Churchill's decision not to warn Coventry before the German bombing raid of November 1940, a choice that allowed the city to be devastated rather than reveal that Enigma had been broken, suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. Operations that had seemed brilliant were revealed to have been informed by intelligence of staggering quality. The war, reconsidered in Ulteros light, was a different war. Gordon Welchman was a man who had seen that war from the inside, and he had carried his version of it through 4 decades of silence. When he finally wrote it down, he was punished for it, and when he died, most of the world still did not know his name. I think about the specific texture of that silence. The dinners where someone praised Eisenhower's strategic genius, and Welchman knew exactly which piece of signals intelligence had informed that strategy. The cocktail parties where someone repeated the wartime mythology about inspired Allied command, and Welchman sat there, holding his drink, knowing the deeper story. The colleagues who built careers writing about the war from the outside, doing careful archival research, producing books and papers and lectures. While Welchman, who knew more than any of them, was legally prohibited from sharing what he knew. There is a psychological literature on this kind of enforced silence. We know now, in ways that were not fully understood in 1945, that the inability to share significant experiences, particularly experiences involving extreme stress, moral weight, or profound achievement, has lasting effects on individuals. The men and women of Bletchley Park were not offered counseling. They were not given any framework for processing what they had seen and done. They were handed their discharge papers and their secrecy oaths and sent back into civilian life carrying the full weight of what they knew. Some of them found ways to live with it. They built new identities. They became professors, civil servants, engineers, housewives, parents. They kept the secret faithfully, sometimes heroically. A number of them died without ever telling their families what they had done during the war. Their children found out only later, sometimes much later, from declassified documents or published histories, and had to reconcile that revelation with decades of knowing their parent as a quiet, private person who never talked about the war. But Welchman carried something heavier than most. He had not just participated in the operation. He had designed it, the hut system, the organizational architecture, the diagonal board, the coordination with American codebreakers, the expansion of the bomb fleet. All of it bore his fingerprints. He was not a soldier who had fought bravely in a battle that others had planned. He was one of the architects of the victory itself. And that knowledge, specific, technical, irreplaceable, sat in him for decades with nowhere to go. When he finally began writing the Hut-6 story in the mid-1970s, he described feeling a very special responsibility. He wrote that he believed he was the only person still alive with inside knowledge of the technical processes by which Enigma had been broken on an industrial scale. He was writing not out of ego. He was writing out of urgency. He was in his late 60s, and he knew that when he was gone, that knowledge would go with him. The living record of one of the most important chapters of the 20th century would close forever. That urgency is what makes the government's response to his book so striking in its cruelty. Here was a man of 75, working from memory and personal correspondence, trying to preserve the technical history of an operation that had used equipment obsolete for 40 years, writing about methods that had been publicly acknowledged in broad outlines since 1974. And the response of the intelligence establishment was to revoke his clearances, cancel his consulting contract, and silence him again. It is worth asking why. The stated justification was that certain technical details remained classified. But classified under what threat? The Enigma machine had not been in active military use since 1945. The specific krypton techniques Welchman described were not applicable to modern digital encryption. The argument that his book represented a live national security threat requires a level of institutional paranoia that even the most generous reading struggles to justify. The more honest answer, perhaps, is that intelligence agencies do not like precedent. They do not like the idea that a man can write a book about classified operations and face only limited consequences. Every concession made to Welchman is a concession that could be demanded by the next person who decides the historical record is more important than the secrecy oath. The punishment was not really about the Hut-6 story. It was about the principle. It was about maintaining the architecture of silence itself. And the man who suffered for it was the man who had, arguably, done more to build the architecture of victory than almost anyone outside the highest levels of Allied command. There is one more dimension to this story that I want you to carry with you. Alan Turing's story has now been told. It has been told in books, in films, in public commemorations, in a posthumous royal pardon, in the decision to put his face on the British £50 note. Turing suffered profoundly. His prosecution for gross indecency in 1952, his chemical castration, his death in 1954, under circumstances that remain disputed. His suffering was of a different kind from Welchman's. His story has become, for good reason, one of the defining moral narratives of the 20th century, but Welchman's story equally central to what happened at Bletchley Park, equally essential to understanding why ultra-worked has remained in relative shadow. The diagonal board, which Turing himself described as the crucial missing piece of his own design, is not a household concept. Hut 6 is not as famous as Hut 8. The name Gordon Welchman does not carry the same cultural weight as the name Alan Turing. Part of that is circumstance. Turing's persecution gave his story a dramatic arc that resonates across decades. Part of it is that Welchman spent the most active years of post-war public life in America, outside the circuit of British public memory. And part of it, undeniably, is the specific form that Welchman's own persecution took. Turing was persecuted by the state in a way that could not be hidden. Welchman was persecuted by silence, by obscurity, by the revocation of clearances, by the withdrawal of institutional legitimacy, by the quiet refusal of the establishment to acknowledge what he had given it. That kind of persecution leaves no visible mark. It is clean, it is efficient, and it works. On October 8, 1985, Gordon Welchman died in his home in Newburyport, Massachusetts. He was buried quietly. His final paper, setting down the last of the technical record he had spent a lifetime trying to preserve, was published in an academic journal 6 months later. Most people who read it at the time did not know who he was. 30 years passed. The BBC documentary came out. The book by Joel Greenberg came out. Slowly, carefully. The historical record was being corrected, but correcting the record is not the same as restoring the man. The recognition that came after Welchman's death could not reach him. He had spent his last years under the shadow of having been branded. At 75, a security risk for writing truthfully about work he had done at age 33. Work that had helped win the war that defined the century. I think about what it means to know something and be forbidden to say it. Not for a year or a decade, but for most of a lifetime. I think about the specific shape of that kind of interior life, the accumulated pressure of unspoken truth, the discipline it takes to hold a secret that belongs to history rather than to you, the strange loneliness of being one of the few people alive who know how the story actually went. Gordon Welchman held that silence for 40 years because he was asked to, and because he understood why, when he finally spoke, the government that had asked him to be silent punished him for it. And yet the record stands. The diagonal board exists. Hut 6 existed. The million German signals that Welchman's organization decrypted exist in the archives. The war ended earlier than it might have, and millions of people who might have died did not die. And Gordon Welchman is part of the reason why. That is the truth that 40 years of silence could not erase. And it is the truth that you now carry with you. Remember his name. I have thought for a long time about what the right word is for what happened to Gordon Welchman. Injustice is too small a word. It implies an aberration, a mistake that could have been corrected, a system that failed to function as intended. What happened to Welchman was not a failure of the system. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. The system was designed to protect secrets indefinitely. The system was designed to prioritize institutional continuity over individual recognition. The system was designed to extract service from the people who served it and return nothing. Not gratitude, not acknowledgement, not even the basic dignity of being allowed to be known. That system worked. It worked for 40 years. And when Welchman finally tried to insert himself back into his own history, the system treated his attempt as a threat rather than as a record. There is a broader principle at work here that extends far beyond Welchman, far beyond Bletchley Park, far beyond even the Second World War. Every major conflict in history has produced its class of invisible contributors, the people who did essential work that was not visible from the outside, whose contributions could not be publicly acknowledged without revealing things that governments needed to keep hidden. The signals intelligence community, the scientists working on classified weapons programs, the translators and analysts and handlers and couriers, whose work happened in the shadows, whose achievements were measured in outcomes rather than in their own names. These people made a bargain with their governments. They gave their intelligence, their labor, their years, their silence. In return, they received In most cases, very little. A pension, perhaps. A service medal, if they were lucky. The knowledge, private and uncelebrated, that they had done something that mattered. For some people, in some circumstances, that bargain feels worth it. The knowledge itself is enough. But there are limits to how long that sufficiency can hold. There are limits to how many decades a man can carry a story before the need to tell it becomes something close to biological. Welchman reached those limits. He was in his mid-70s. He was watching the last witnesses to what had happened at Bletchley Park die around him, and he could see that the technical history of the operation was going to vanish with them. He wrote, not from vanity, but from something that looked more like a kind of stewardship. He was trying to preserve a record that belonged not to him personally, but to history. The fact that the intelligence establishment treated that stewardship as a betrayal tells you something important about how institutions relate to the people who served them. I want to stay with the technical dimension of Welchman's contribution for a moment longer, because I think it is underappreciated even among people who know the broad outlines of the Bletchley Park story. The diagonal board was not a minor refinement. It was a conceptual breakthrough of the first order. Turing's original bomb design was elegant and necessary. Without it, industrial-scale Enigma decryption would have been impossible. But without the diagonal board, the bomb would have produced so many false positives that the analytical burden of checking them would have made the entire operation unworkable at the scale required to cover all the German cipher networks simultaneously. To understand the scale of what Hut-6 achieved under Welchman's leadership, consider this: by 1943, the operation was breaking more than 20 separate Enigma keys every single day. Each key represented a different cipher network, different branch of the Wehrmacht, different operational theater, different command level. Each break required running the bombs against inner traffic using the specific cribs and techniques applicable to that network. The logistics of managing that operation, coordinating hundreds of bomb machines, managing the flow of intercepted traffic, training and deploying the hundreds of Wrens who operated the machines, distributing the intelligence to commanders in the field through the ultra-dissemination system, was an organizational achievement as much as a cryptanalytic one. Welchman had designed that organization. The Hut system, the workflow, the coordination protocols, all of it bore the imprint of his thinking. He had looked at the problem in 1939 not just as a mathematician trying to crack a cipher, but as a systems designer trying to build a factory. And the factory he built produced, over the course of the war, close to 1 million decrypted German signals. 1 million. Each one of those decrypts was a window into the operational planning of the German military. Each one revealed something: a troop movement, a supply shortage, a command decision, a vulnerability. The accumulated intelligence picture built from those decrypts was unlike anything that had existed in the history of warfare. Allied commanders in the field received intelligence about German dispositions and intentions that was, in some cases, more detailed and more current than what German field commanders themselves possessed. The strategic advantage that flowed from Ultra was not marginal. It was transformative. And sitting at the center of the machine that produced it was Gordon Welchman, a Cambridge Doan who had been handed a pile of practice messages in a windowless room and had responded by reimagining the entire architecture of how the operation needed to work. After the war, as Primera told you, Welchman moved to America and reinvented himself as a defense tech. His work on Project Whirlwind at MIT, one of the earliest applications of digital computers to real-time data processing, drew on the systems thinking he had developed at Bletchley. Though he could not say so, his later work on military communications systems at MITRE was similarly informed. He was building, throughout the post-war decades, on insights that he had developed in the context of breaking Enigma's insights about how communication networks could be made secure, about how information could be reliably encrypted and transmitted under adversarial conditions. His contributions to the architecture of Cold War communication systems were real and significant, but they were contributions made in a context where the source of his thinking could not be acknowledged. This is the paradox at the heart of his professional life for 3 decades. He was building on what he had learned. The people he worked with could see that he was exceptional. That unusual intuitive grasp of communications security that went beyond what his formal post-war resume could explain, but he could not tell them where that grasp had come from. He could not cite the 4 years he had spent running the most important signals intelligence operation in the history of warfare as a formative professional experience. He was, in the most profound sense, professionally When Winterbotham's book came out in 1974 and the broad fact of Enigma's decryption became public, Welchman must have felt something complex and difficult to name. Relief, perhaps, at the general confirmation, but also, I imagine, a kind of frustration at the incompleteness of the account. Winterbottom had described the intelligence outputs, what had been read, how it had been used, what effect it had on the war. He had not, and could not, describe the technical machinery that had produced it. The bomb was mentioned, the diagonal board was not. HUT-6's organizational architecture was not. The specific contributions that Welchman had made, the things that had differentiated the British operation from any previous or contemporary signals intelligence effort, were still unacknowledged. So, WWII, and when the government revoked his clearances in response, I think the specific quality of his response, measured, precise, tinged with disbelief rather than anger, tells you something essential about the kind of man he was. He did not mount a public campaign. He did not seek legal redress. He continued to correspond, continued to think, continued to try to set the record straight through whatever channels remained available to him. He wrote the final paper. He kept the record alive as long as he could. There is a passage in the account of his response to the security investigation that has stayed with me. He described being interviewed by agents and realizing, in the course of the interview, that the information they were treating as classified, the information they were telling him he should not have published, was information that he had carried in his own memory for 40 years. They were, in effect, telling him that his own recollections were a national security risk. His memory was classified. The things he had witnessed and participated in and built. The events he had lived through these things belonged not to him but to the state. He was not permitted to remember them in public. That is a remarkable position for a government to take. It is also, when you think about it carefully, a position that governments have always implicitly taken with respect to the people who carry their secrets. The secret does not belong to the person who holds it. It belongs to the institution. The person is merely the vessel. And when the vessel decides that the secret has been held long enough, that the historical record has a legitimate claim on the truth, the institution's response is to reassert ownership, to remind the vessel that the contents were never theirs to dispense. Gordon Welchman died without seeing his contribution properly acknowledged. That is a fact. The posthumous documentary, the biography, the academic papers that have since analyzed his work in detail, all of it came after. The recognition arrived, but it arrived like a letter that reaches its destination after the recipient has already moved away. The address is correct, the content is accurate, but there is no one there to receive it. I find myself returning again and again to the image of Welchman in that final period of his life, in his late 70s, in Newburyport, Massachusetts, working through his memories, writing the paper that would be published after his death, still trying to get the record right, still trying to tell the truth about what had happened in HUT-6, about what the diagonal board had done, about how the war had actually been fought at the level of signals and cipher and mathematical pattern. He had been punished for telling that truth. He was telling it anyway. That persistence, quiet, determined, not dramatic in the ways that popular history tends to recognize, is itself a form of heroism. Not the heroism of the battlefield, which is visible and immediate, and allows for public recognition. The heroism of the archivist, the heroism of the witness who refuses to let the record be closed just because the institution that holds it would prefer silence. The men who went over the top at the sum knew that their courage would be seen. The men who decoded German signals in a windowless hut in Buckinghamshire knew that theirs would not. They made that bargain with open eyes. Welchman made it, held it for 4 decades, and then when he finally tried to complete the historical record, found that the bargain had terms he had not been told about, terms that extended beyond his death, beyond the obsolescence of the technology, beyond any rational definition of national security interest. The story of Gordon Welchman is the story of what happens when institutions that depend on secrecy encounter the men and women who made that secrecy possible. It is the story of what loyalty costs when it is asymmetric, when the individual gives everything and the institution gives back as little as it can manage. It is the story of the gap between what history records and what history was. And it is, ultimately, the story of a man who saw everything, was forbidden to speak for 40 years, and then spent what remained of his life trying to say it anyway. Remember his name.